Marcus Wellington adjusted his Rolex as he stepped out of his penthouse elevator, the weight of another sleepless night pressing down on his shoulders. At 38, he commanded a tech empire worth $12 billion, yet tonight felt different. The acquisition deal that had consumed his last 6 months was finally complete, but instead of celebration, an inexplicable restlessness gnawed at him. His assistant had left hours ago. His security team waited in the lobby, and the city sprawled below his floor-to-ceiling windows like a glittering circuit board. He grabbed his keys to the Bentley, deciding a late-night drive might clear his head. The streets were quieter at this hour, with only the occasional taxi or delivery truck breaking the urban silence. As he navigated through downtown, his phone buzzed with congratulatory messages from board members and investors, but he ignored them all. Money had never been the driving force behind his success. It was the thrill of solving problems, of creating something meaningful. Yet lately, that thrill had faded into a monotonous routine of meetings, decisions, and more meetings. His thoughts drifted to his late father, who had built the company from nothing, working 16-hour days in a cramped garage. Marcus had inherited not just wealth, but a legacy of determination and compassion that his father had instilled in him. The old man had always said that true success was measured not by what you accumulated, but by what you gave back. As he drove past the hospital district, Marcus noticed a figure walking slowly along the sidewalk. Even from a distance, he could tell it was a woman, and something about her careful, deliberate steps made him slow down. She was clearly pregnant, her hand resting protectively on her belly as she made her way down the dimly lit street. What struck him most was her uniform, the light blue scrubs that indicated she was a healthcare worker, probably finishing a long shift. The sight triggered something deep in his memory, a recognition of struggle and determination that reminded him of his own mother's stories about working multiple jobs to support their family before his father's business took off. He found himself following at a respectful distance, not out of any ill intent, but driven by a curiosity he couldn't quite explain. The woman moved with purpose despite her obvious exhaustion, and Marcus found himself wondering about her story. Where was she going at this hour? Did she have family waiting for her? The questions multiplied as he watched her navigate the empty streets with the confidence of someone who had walked this route countless times before. His expensive car felt suddenly conspicuous, and he dimmed his headlights, maintaining enough distance to avoid alarming her while satisfying his growing need to understand what he was witnessing. Rebecca Martinez felt the familiar ache in her lower back as she left St. Mary's Hospital through the staff exit. The double shift had been particularly brutal: 3 emergency surgeries, 2 difficult births, and a steady stream of patients that never seemed to end. At 7 months pregnant, her body protested every extra hour, but the overtime pay was essential. Her husband David had been laid off from the construction company 6 weeks ago, and their savings were dwindling faster than she cared to calculate. The baby wasn't due for another 2 months, but everything cost more than they had anticipated. Insurance covered some expenses, but not the crib, car seat, and countless other necessities that filled her Amazon cart but remained unpurchased. She pulled her cardigan tighter against the cool night air and began the familiar walk home. The bus had stopped running an hour ago, and a taxi was an expense she couldn't justify when her legs still worked fine. The 20-minute walk had become routine, a time to decompress from the intensity of the hospital and prepare for a few hours of sleep before David's job interviews began. She had taken this route hundreds of times, knew every crack in the sidewalk, every shortcut through the residential blocks. The neighborhood changed as she walked, from the medical district with its bright lights and security cameras to the older residential area where she and David rented their small apartment. Tonight felt different, though. A strange awareness prickled at the back of her neck, the sensation of being watched. She had learned to trust her instincts during her nursing career, and something told her she wasn't alone. She glanced back once, noting the expensive car that seemed to be maintaining pace with her walking speed, but she didn't feel threatened. If anything, there was something protective about the presence behind her. Years of working night shifts had taught her to distinguish between different types of attention, and this felt more like concern than menace. She continued walking, her hand instinctively resting on her belly as the baby shifted inside her. The little one had been active tonight, perhaps responding to her stress levels or the long hours on her feet. She whispered softly to her unborn child, a habit she had developed during these solitary walks. The conversation helped pass the time and created a sense of connection with the life growing inside her. Rebecca had always wanted to be a mother, but the timing felt overwhelming. David's unemployment had changed everything, forcing them to make difficult decisions about their future. They had postponed buying a house, canceled their small wedding plans, and now faced the reality of bringing a child into an uncertain financial situation. The residential streets grew quieter as Rebecca turned onto Maple Avenue, her footsteps echoing against the sleeping houses. Porch lights cast small pools of yellow light every few yards, creating a dotted path toward home. She could see her apartment building in the distance, a modest 3-story structure that had seen better days but remained affordable. The lawn needed attention, and the exterior paint was fading, but it was theirs for now. David would be sleeping, probably sprawled across their small bed with his phone still in his hand from scrolling through job listings. He had been trying so hard to find work, attending interviews, networking events, and even considering jobs outside his field. The rejection emails had been coming regularly, each one chipping away at his confidence. Rebecca understood the toll unemployment took on a person's sense of worth, had seen it countless times in her patients who faced financial hardship alongside medical challenges. She paused at the corner of her street, the familiar sight of home bringing mixed emotions. Relief at completing another shift, anxiety about tomorrow's bills, hope for David's job prospects, and excitement about the baby's arrival all swirled together. The car she had noticed earlier had disappeared, leaving her alone with the night sounds of the city, distant traffic, the hum of air conditioning units, and the occasional bark of a neighborhood dog. She climbed the 3 steps to her building's front door, fishing for her keys in the depths of her purse. The hallway smelled of cooking spices and cleaning supplies, a combination that had become comforting over the 2 years they had lived here. Their apartment was on the second floor, and she took the stairs slowly, mindful of her balance and the baby's weight. The door to 2B creaked as she opened it, and she could hear David's soft snoring from the bedroom. She set down her purse and kicked off her shoes, the relief immediate and profound. The apartment was small but clean, decorated with hand-me-down furniture and photographs of their families. Rebecca moved through the living room, picking up the scattered job applications and newspapers that marked David's daily routine. She loved him deeply, but the stress of their situation had tested their relationship in ways she hadn't expected. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and new hopes for their growing family. Marcus had watched the woman disappear into the apartment building, but something compelled him to park across the street and wait. He couldn't explain the pull he felt, the need to understand more about her story. The building looked tired, with peeling paint and a front step that needed repair, but it was well maintained enough to suggest caring tenants. He had grown up in a similar building 3 states away, before his father's company had lifted their family into a different world entirely. The memories of those early years remained vivid. His mother working double shifts at the diner, his father hunched over engineering drawings at their kitchen table, the constant background hum of financial worry that colored every family decision. As he sat in his car, Marcus realized he was witnessing something that had become foreign to his current life. Genuine struggle mixed with quiet determination. The woman's careful steps, her protective hand on her belly, the way she had navigated the empty streets with confidence despite her exhaustion, it all spoke to a strength he rarely encountered in his circles of wealth and privilege. His phone buzzed again, this time with a message from his publicist about a charity gala next month. The irony wasn't lost on him that he would spend thousands of dollars on a single dinner to raise money for causes he barely understood, while a pregnant woman walked home alone after working all night to pay her bills. He had become disconnected from the very people his charitable efforts were meant to help. The revelation felt like a punch to his chest, a recognition of how insulated his world had become. He thought about the last time he had spoken to someone who worried about rent money or grocery bills, and couldn't remember when that might have been. Even his household staff were well compensated, shielded from the financial pressures that most Americans face daily. The woman in the blue scrubs had reminded him of something essential, something his father had tried to teach him about staying connected to the people who made the world work. Marcus made a decision that surprised him. Instead of driving home to his penthouse, he would come back tomorrow night. He needed to understand more about this woman's story, not as a billionaire looking for a tax write-off, but as a human being seeking connection with the struggles that had shaped his own family's journey to success. The next evening, Marcus found himself returning to the hospital district earlier than before. He had spent the day in meetings, but his mind kept drifting to the pregnant woman in scrubs. His assistant had noticed his distraction, commenting on his unusual preoccupation with the time. He had made an excuse about having dinner plans, which wasn't entirely untrue. He planned to grab something quick before beginning his vigil. The hospital's main entrance buzzed with activity even at this late hour, and Marcus positioned himself across the street with a clear view of the staff exit. He felt slightly foolish, a billionaire playing amateur detective, but the need to understand had only grown stronger overnight. At exactly 11:30, she emerged from the same door, moving with the same careful deliberation as before. Tonight she looked even more tired, her hand pressed more firmly against her lower back as she began her walk home. Marcus started his engine and began the slow procession he had established the night before, maintaining distance while ensuring she remained in sight. The routine was identical, the same route, the same quiet streets, the same pause at the corner of her street. But tonight, something was different. As she climbed the steps to her building, Marcus noticed her movements were more labored, her breathing slightly more pronounced. She paused twice on the short flight of stairs, both hands now supporting her back. The sight filled him with an unexpected concern, as if he were watching a family member struggle. He remained parked across the street long after she disappeared inside, wondering about her husband, her job, the baby's due date. The questions multiplied, each one adding to his growing investment in her story. Marcus had always prided himself on being a problem solver, someone who could identify inefficiencies and create solutions. But this wasn't a business challenge. It was a human situation that required a different kind of understanding. He realized he was developing genuine care for someone whose name he didn't even know, whose life intersected with his only through these brief nighttime observations. The recognition both thrilled and terrified him. When had he last felt this kind of authentic concern for another person's well-being? His romantic relationships had been strategic, his friendships largely transactional, his family interactions complicated by wealth and expectations. This woman represented something pure, something real that his money couldn't buy or influence. Rebecca noticed the car again on her third night walking home, and this time she was certain it was following her. The realization should have frightened her, but instead, it brought an odd sense of security. Whoever was behind the wheel maintained a respectful distance and made no attempt to approach or intimidate her. If anything, the presence felt protective, like having a guardian angel with expensive taste in automobiles. She had mentioned it to David that morning, describing the mysterious follower in casual terms that didn't alarm him. He had been distracted anyway, preparing for another job interview that would likely end in disappointment. The construction industry remained slow, and his specialized skills in commercial foundation work were in limited demand. Rebecca had learned not to ask too many questions about his job search, knowing that each inquiry reminded him of his current inability to provide for their growing family. The weight of being the sole breadwinner pressed down on her shoulders almost as heavily as the baby pressed against her ribs. Tonight had been particularly challenging at the hospital. They had lost a patient, an elderly man who had reminded her of her own grandfather, and the grief had lingered throughout her shift. Death was part of nursing, something she had learned to process and compartmentalize, but pregnancy had made her more emotional, more susceptible to the sadness that sometimes overwhelmed the medical profession. She found herself crying in supply closets and bathroom stalls, hormone-driven tears that felt both justified and embarrassing. The walk home had become more than transportation. It was therapy, a time to process the day's events and prepare for whatever tomorrow might bring. As she turned onto her street, Rebecca felt the baby shift, a rolling movement that suggested the little one was settling in for the night. She paused under a streetlight, placing both hands on her belly and breathing deeply. The car that had been following her stopped as well, far enough away to avoid intrusion but close enough to maintain its strange vigil. She wondered about the driver, about their motivation for this nightly routine. Was it someone who knew her, a concerned citizen, a hospital administrator checking on employee safety? The possibilities ranged from mundane to disturbing, but her instincts continued to suggest benevolence rather than threat. Rebecca had always trusted her ability to read people, a skill that served her well in nursing where patient assessment often began with intuition rather than medical instruments. Marcus had been following Rebecca for a week when he witnessed something that changed everything. It was Thursday night, and the routine had become familiar. Her emergence from the hospital, the slow walk through quieting neighborhoods, the pause at her building's entrance. But tonight, as she climbed the steps to her apartment, she suddenly stopped midway and gripped the railing with both hands. From his position across the street, Marcus could see her body tense, her breathing become labored. She remained frozen for several seconds, clearly experiencing some form of distress. Without thinking, Marcus was out of his car and crossing the street before his rational mind could intervene. He reached the bottom of the steps just as Rebecca sank down onto the concrete, her face pale and her hands trembling. The distance between them collapsed in an instant. Billionaire and nurse brought together by a moment of human crisis. She looked up at him with a mixture of surprise and recognition, her eyes wide with pain and confusion. Marcus knelt beside her, his expensive suit forgotten as he focused entirely on her immediate needs. He had taken first aid courses as part of his pilot training, but this situation required more than textbook knowledge. Rebecca was clearly in labor, weeks before her due date, and the hospital that could help her was blocks away. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on him. He had been watching over her from afar, and now he was literally at her side when she needed help most. His hands shook as he pulled out his phone to call for an ambulance, but Rebecca grabbed his wrist with surprising strength. Through gritted teeth, she managed to speak, her voice strained but determined. She told him her name, asked him to call David, and provided instructions with the clinical precision of someone who had guided countless others through medical emergencies. Marcus found himself taking orders from the woman he had been secretly observing, and it felt like the most natural thing in the world. The mysterious follower had become an unexpected ally, and their two worlds were about to collide in ways neither could have anticipated. As they waited for the ambulance, Marcus held Rebecca's hand and realized that everything he thought he knew about purpose and meaning was about to be redefined by a woman whose strength dwarfed his billion-dollar achievements. The ambulance arrived within minutes, but it felt like hours to Marcus as he knelt beside Rebecca on the apartment steps. She had gripped his hand throughout the contractions, her nursing training evident in the way she breathed through the pain and provided clear information to the paramedics. Marcus found himself reluctant to let go when they transferred her to the stretcher, as if their connection had become a lifeline for both of them. He followed the ambulance to St. Mary's Hospital in his Bentley, the same hospital where Rebecca worked, where her colleagues were now treating her as a patient rather than a peer. The emergency room staff recognized her immediately, their concern evident as they whisked her away to the maternity ward. Marcus felt lost in the bright lights and bustling activity, his expensive clothes and obvious wealth making him conspicuous among the families and patients who filled the waiting area. He had called David from Rebecca's phone, delivering the news with as much calm as he could muster. The man's panic had been palpable even through the phone, his voice cracking as he asked questions Marcus couldn't answer. David was racing to the hospital from their apartment, probably running red lights and praying to whatever deity might be listening. Marcus realized he was praying too, something he hadn't done since his father's funeral 5 years earlier. The waiting room became a kind of purgatory, filled with the anxious energy of people hopping for good news. Marcus sat among them, his presence surreal even to himself. 12 hours earlier, he had been reviewing acquisition documents in his penthouse office. Now he was emotionally invested in the outcome of a birth, connected to a family he had only just met. The transformation felt seismic, as if the foundation of his carefully constructed life had shifted beneath him. He thought about the moment when Rebecca had looked into his eyes, recognizing him as her mysterious follower but showing no fear, only gratitude. That look had conveyed more trust than he had earned in most of his business relationships. When David arrived, breathless and wild-eyed, Marcus stood to meet him. The introduction was awkward. How do you explain that you've been following someone's wife for a week? But David's focus was entirely on Rebecca, and Marcus found himself stepping back, unsure of his role in this unfolding drama. He had inserted himself into their lives at a crucial moment, but now he wondered if he belonged here at all. David Martinez had always been a practical man, someone who faced problems head-on and found solutions through hard work and determination. But standing in the hospital corridor, listening to a stranger explain how he had been following his wife and happened to be there when she went into labor, challenged every assumption he had about coincidence and fate. The man who had called him was clearly wealthy. Everything from his clothes to his watch screamed money, but his concern for Rebecca seemed genuine. David's initial suspicion gave way to gratitude as he realized that, without this stranger's intervention, Rebecca might have been alone on those apartment steps, giving birth weeks early without any help. The doctors had explained that Rebecca's labor had likely been triggered by stress and exhaustion, conditions that David blamed himself for creating. If he had been able to find work, if he had been better at providing for their family, maybe she wouldn't have been walking home alone at midnight after working double shifts. The guilt was crushing, but he pushed it aside to focus on what mattered most: Rebecca and their baby. Marcus, whose name David had finally learned, remained in the waiting room like a silent guardian. There was something almost paternal about his presence, as if he had somehow adopted their small family during their crisis. David found himself wondering about the man's story, about what would drive someone with obvious resources to spend his nights following a pregnant nurse. The behavior should have been creepy, but instead it felt protective, as if Marcus had somehow sensed that Rebecca needed looking after. When the doctor finally emerged with news, both men stood simultaneously, their shared anxiety creating an unexpected bond. Rebecca was stable, but the baby was coming whether they were ready or not. It was too early, but not dangerously so, and the medical team was optimistic about the outcome. David felt his knees weaken with relief, and Marcus steadied him with a firm hand on his shoulder. The gesture felt natural, as if they had been friends for years rather than strangers thrown together by circumstance. As David was led back to see Rebecca, he turned to Marcus with a question that had been building since their first awkward introduction. Why had he been following her? The answer would either make sense of this surreal night or confirm David's worst fears about the intentions of wealthy strangers. Marcus had dreaded this moment, knowing that his explanation would sound either crazy or sinister to Rebecca's husband. How could he explain that he had been searching for something authentic in his life, something real that his money couldn't buy? How could he make David understand that following Rebecca had been less about her specifically and more about his own need to connect with genuine human struggle? The words came haltingly at first, Marcus struggling to articulate feelings he barely understood himself. He told David about the sleepless nights, the growing emptiness despite his business success, the way Rebecca's determination had reminded him of his own parents' struggles. He described the night he had first seen her walking home, how something about her careful steps and protective posture had triggered memories of his mother's stories about working multiple jobs to support their family. David listened without interrupting, his expression shifting from suspicion to understanding as Marcus revealed the depth of his disconnection from normal life. The billionaire's wealth had become a barrier between him and the experiences that shaped most people's lives. He had lost touch with struggle, with the daily challenges that built character and created meaning. Rebecca had represented something he had been missing, a window into the world he had left behind in his climb to success. As Marcus spoke, he realized he was confessing to more than just following Rebecca. He was admitting to a kind of existential crisis that money couldn't solve. David's response surprised him. Instead of anger or confusion, David nodded slowly, as if Marcus's explanation made perfect sense. He had seen the same thing in his own life, the way unemployment had stripped away his sense of purpose and identity. They were both men searching for meaning, though their circumstances were vastly different. The conversation was interrupted by a nurse who invited David to meet his son. The baby had arrived healthy despite being 3 weeks early, and Rebecca was asking for both men. David looked at Marcus with an expression that mixed gratitude and invitation. Whatever had brought them together, it had resulted in something precious, a healthy baby, and a new understanding between strangers who had become something more. As they walked toward the maternity ward together, Marcus felt a transformation beginning inside him, a shift away from the isolation of wealth toward something more valuable than money could buy. Rebecca held her son for the first time while two men who should have been strangers stood beside her hospital bed, their faces reflecting the same wonder she felt. The baby was small but perfect, his tiny fingers wrapped around her thumb with surprising strength. David wept openly, his unemployment forgotten in the face of this miracle. Marcus stood slightly apart, his expensive suit looking out of place in the modest hospital room, but his expression was soft with an emotion Rebecca recognized from her years of nursing, pure, uncomplicated joy. The story of how Marcus had been following her should have been disturbing, but his explanation had touched something deep in Rebecca's heart. She understood loneliness, the way it could drive people to seek connection in unexpected places. His presence during her labor had been a gift, transforming what could have been a terrifying experience into something manageable. As she looked at her son, Rebecca felt a profound gratitude for the strange series of events that had brought Marcus into their lives. The baby stirred in her arms, and she whispered his name for the first time, Samuel David Martinez, after both grandfathers. The name felt right, solid, and strong like the men who surrounded him. Marcus stepped closer, his eyes fixed on the tiny face that had changed everything. He asked permission before touching the baby's hand, his voice thick with emotion. The gesture was gentle, reverent, as if he were holding something sacred. Rebecca realized that Marcus was seeing more than just a baby. He was seeing possibility, hope, a future that connected him to something larger than himself. The three adults formed an unlikely triangle around the newborn, their different backgrounds and circumstances unified by the simple miracle of new life. Rebecca felt the exhaustion of labor beginning to claim her, but she fought against sleep, unwilling to break the spell that had transformed them from strangers into family. The night had started with her walking home alone after another difficult shift, and now she was surrounded by love and protection she hadn't known she needed. As Samuel slept in her arms, Rebecca wondered how different their lives might have been if Marcus hadn't been following her that first night. The thought was both sobering and grateful, a recognition that sometimes the most important moments in life came from the most unexpected sources. She looked at David, then at Marcus, and saw the same transformation in both their faces, the look of men who had found something worth protecting. The next few days passed in a blur of hospital routines and unexpected conversations. Marcus had insisted on moving Rebecca to a private room, an offer that David had initially refused out of pride before Rebecca gently convinced him to accept. The gesture wasn't about charity. It was about ensuring that Samuel had the best possible start in life. Marcus visited twice daily, bringing flowers for Rebecca and coffee for David, but mostly he came to hold the baby. There was something transformative about watching him cradle Samuel, this billionaire who commanded corporate empires, reduced to wonder by 7 pounds of humanity. Rebecca noticed how Marcus's entire demeanor changed when he held her son, his usually sharp features softening into something almost boyish. He would whisper to Samuel, telling him about the world he would inherit, making promises about opportunities and adventures that made Rebecca's heart ache with their sincerity. David had overcome his initial wariness and now looked forward to Marcus's visits, the two men bonding over their shared fascination with the baby and their mutual respect for Rebecca's strength. The conversations ranged from practical matters like health insurance and pediatric care to deeper discussions about fatherhood and responsibility. Marcus absorbed every detail about newborn care with the same intensity he had once applied to hostile takeovers, asking questions that revealed both his inexperience and his genuine desire to learn. Rebecca found herself becoming the teacher, explaining feeding schedules and diaper changes to a man who could buy hospitals, but had never changed a diaper in his life. The role reversal delighted her. This opportunity to share her expertise with someone who usually had all the answers. When the pediatrician declared Samuel healthy enough to go home, Rebecca felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. The hospital had become a cocoon, a place where Marcus's presence felt natural and their unlikely friendship could develop without outside scrutiny. Going home meant returning to reality, to the cramped apartment and David's continued unemployment and the countless challenges of new parenthood. But it also meant beginning their real life as a family, with all the messy beauty that entailed. Marcus had offered to help with expenses, but David had firmly declined, maintaining his dignity even as he accepted the friendship that had grown between them. The drive home was symbolic, David behind the wheel of their aging Honda, while Marcus followed in his Bentley, a convoy that represented their different worlds coming together around a shared commitment to Samuel's future. The apartment felt different when they returned, smaller somehow, but also more significant. This was where they would raise their son, where he would take his first steps and speak his first words. Rebecca moved through the familiar rooms with new eyes, seeing them as a nursery and playground rather than just a place to sleep between shifts. Marcus had quietly arranged for a crib, changing table, and other essentials to be delivered, items that appeared with cards reading "For Samuel," with love from his uncle Marcus. The title had emerged naturally, a recognition that Marcus had become family in a way that transcended blood or law. David had returned to his job search with renewed determination, buoyed by the confidence that came from becoming a father. Marcus had offered to help with connections, but David wanted to find work on his own merits. The compromise was that Marcus would serve as a reference, his name carrying weight in construction circles even if David's potential employers never knew the full story of how they had met. Rebecca had taken family leave from the hospital, her first extended break in 3 years. The time at home with Samuel was precious, but she also missed the structure and purpose of her work. She had been a nurse longer than she had been a mother, and the identity shift was more challenging than she had anticipated. Marcus understood her restlessness, having experienced his own struggles with purpose and meaning. He suggested she consider returning to school, pursuing the advanced degree in nursing management she had always wanted but never had time for. The idea terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. During his evening visits, Marcus would hold Samuel while Rebecca and David talked about their dreams for the future. The conversations were honest and sometimes painful, touching on their fears about money and parenthood, and the uncertainty that colored every major decision. Marcus listened more than he spoke, his presence a stabilizing force that allowed them to express doubts they might not have shared with anyone else. The baby seemed to sense the love that surrounded him, sleeping peacefully in Marcus's arms, while the three adults planned a future none of them could have imagined weeks earlier. These quiet evenings became the foundation of their unlikely family, built on trust and mutual respect rather than blood or obligation. 3 months after Samuel's birth, their unusual arrangement had settled into a comfortable rhythm. Marcus had become Uncle Marcus to everyone in the building, his expensive cars no longer drawing stares from neighbors who had grown accustomed to seeing him carry groceries upstairs or push a stroller around the block. David had found work with a construction company that specialized in green building techniques, a job that challenged him professionally while paying enough to ease their financial pressures. Rebecca had enrolled in an online nursing program, studying during Samuel's naps while Marcus handled the afternoon feeding. The role of honorary uncle suited Marcus perfectly, giving him purpose without the full responsibility of parenthood. He had learned to change diapers, mix formula, and interpret the different cries that meant hunger versus sleepiness versus the need for attention. Samuel had become the center of a universe that included two fathers and a mother who shared the duties of parenting with a grace that surprised them all. The arrangement raised eyebrows among Marcus's business associates, who couldn't understand why a billionaire would spend his evenings babysitting instead of networking at exclusive events. But Marcus had found something in that cramped apartment that all his money couldn't buy. A sense of belonging that came from being needed rather than feared or courted. Rebecca watched the transformation with professional interest, recognizing the healing that was taking place. Marcus had been wounded by his own success, isolated by wealth and expectations that had left him emotionally bankrupt. Samuel had given him a chance to love without agenda, to care for someone who would never ask for stock options or board positions. The baby responded to Marcus's attention with the same enthusiasm he showed David, recognizing both men as sources of security and affection. The sight of Samuel reaching for Marcus with chubby arms never failed to move Rebecca, a reminder that family could be created as well as inherited. Their small apartment had become a sanctuary for all three adults, a place where titles and bank accounts mattered less than the simple act of caring for a child who had brought them together. The outside world might not understand their arrangement, but inside those walls, they had created something beautiful and functional and real. The first crisis came when Samuel developed a fever at 4 months old. Rebecca's nursing training told her it was likely nothing serious, but her mother's heart demanded immediate action. The pediatrician confirmed her assessment, a minor virus that would pass in a few days, but the experience revealed the depth of their interconnection. Marcus had canceled board meetings to sit in the emergency room, his face pale with worry as doctors examined Samuel. David had called in sick to work, and Rebecca had functioned on pure adrenaline and medical instinct. For 48 hours, They had taken shifts monitoring Samuel's temperature and ensuring he stayed hydrated. Marcus had proven surprisingly skilled at coaxing medicine into a resistant baby, his patience exceeding even Rebecca's. The crisis passed, but it left them all changed, more aware of how much they had invested in this child who had become the center of their shared world. Rebecca realized that Marcus wasn't just helping with Samuel out of guilt or obligation. He loved the baby with a fierce protectiveness that matched her own. The recognition was both comforting and overwhelming, adding another layer to their complex relationship. Samuel recovered completely, but the adults carried the memory of those tense days as a reminder of how quickly everything could change. They had functioned as a unit during the crisis, each person contributing their strengths while supporting the other's weaknesses. Marcus had provided resources and connections. David had offered physical strength and emotional steadiness, and Rebecca had supplied medical knowledge and maternal instinct. The combination had been powerful, more effective than any one of them could have been alone. As Samuel returned to his normal routine of eating, sleeping, and charming everyone who met him, Rebecca felt a deep gratitude for the strange circumstances that had brought them together. The baby had saved them all in different ways, giving Marcus purpose, David confidence, and Rebecca a support system she had never known she needed. The fever had been a test, and they had passed it with flying colors, emerging stronger and more committed to their unusual family structure. Rebecca began to believe that what they had built could last, that the love they shared was strong enough to overcome any challenges that might come their way. Samuel's first birthday approached with a significance that surprised everyone. Marcus had wanted to throw an elaborate party, complete with professional photographers and a guest list that included other wealthy families with children. Rebecca and David had gently suggested something smaller, more intimate, focused on the people who had actually been part of Samuel's first year. The compromise was a celebration in the apartment building's courtyard, with decorations that Marcus had commissioned from a party planning service, but food that Rebecca and David had prepared themselves. The guest list included their neighbors, Rebecca's colleagues from the hospital, David's new coworkers, and Marcus's assistant who had become genuinely fond of the baby. The mix of social classes and backgrounds created an atmosphere unlike any party Marcus had ever attended, relaxed and genuine in ways that reminded him why he had fallen in love with this family in the first place. Samuel, now walking and babbling with increasing sophistication, held court like a tiny king, accepting admiration from adults who had watched him grow from a premature newborn into a healthy, happy toddler. Marcus had commissioned a professional photographer, but the best pictures were the candid shots that captured the joy on David's face as he watched his son take unsteady steps, or the pride in Rebecca's eyes as Samuel demonstrated his latest accomplishment. The party was a success by any measure, but its real value was in the way it showcased the community they had built around Samuel. The baby had become a bridge between different worlds, allowing Marcus to connect with people he would never have met otherwise. Rebecca's nursing colleagues were initially intimidated by Marcus's wealth, but his obvious devotion to Samuel and his genuine interest in their stories quickly put them at ease. David's construction buddies had arrived prepared to dislike the rich guy who had inserted himself into their friend's life. But Marcus's willingness to talk about building techniques and his respect for skilled labor won them over. As the party wound down and guests began to leave, Marcus found himself helping with cleanup, stacking chairs and collecting paper plates, as if he had been doing such tasks his entire life. The domesticity of the moment struck him as profoundly satisfying, more rewarding than any corporate victory he had ever achieved. This was what he had been searching for during those sleepless nights, not adventure or excitement, but the simple pleasure of being useful to people he loved. The second year of Samuel's life brought new challenges and deeper connections. Marcus had restructured his business commitments, delegating more responsibilities to trusted executives so he could maintain his role in Samuel's daily routine. The decision had raised concerns among his board members, who worried about his focus and dedication to the company. But Marcus had never been more productive or creative, his emotional fulfillment translating into sharper business instincts and better decision-making. Rebecca had completed her online coursework and was considering a promotion to nursing supervisor, a position that would mean better pay, but also more administrative responsibilities and less patient contact. The decision weighed heavily on her, representing a choice between